can hear me and see my presentations, my slides. So yes, I had the pleasure to uh, work with Professor Solo Olawi some time ago, and it's a great pleasure to be here and a privilege. So I'm going to have some high-level reflections about designing surgical trials for glaucoma in your area. I must say I don't have professional experience in working in Africa, but I hope that my reflections are relevant to you all. So first, I was going to, there is a fascinating presentation this morning about, goals, trying to involve patients, relevant comments about the cost, which is a potential significant factor for blindness, not the disease per se. But one of the important aspects I would like to discuss is how to define what is important research priorities, and I'll share my experience. Then I'm gonna talk about how to design surgical trials and bring the ideal collaboration. Some of you may be familiar with it for facilitating and implementing innovation research in surgery. And just last, a few comments about surgical registry and the importance of electronic medical records data research, particularly in glaucoma and glaucoma surgeries. So recently we published this a couple of years ago to try to identify research priorities for glaucoma from the perspective of the European glaucoma clinicians, surgeons, and patients. And this is a well-defined model. There are different ways. We use a similar pathway as the James Lind Alliance. Essentially, what we're trying to do is to identify what's important for patients and surgeons and clinicians, and trying to keep those who are heavily involved in academics and not so involved, because you, the clinicians, doctors, ophthalmologists, optometrists, you know what are the important topics, the unmet needs. You're in the trenches, taking care and under difficult situations, and with the frustration of seeing people going blind from glaucoma. As it was mentioned, most of glaucoma is potentially preventable. So this is also another value from the point of view of funders. Once you have this process and these priorities from patients, from doctors, from clinicians, then you have a strong case. You don't need to persuade the funders that your proposal is important if it meets some of these research priorities. So it's a real value. And what we did was mainly an online modified Delphi process. And this is very efficient because, of course, you can reach out a lot of people, a lot of clinicians, potentially patients may be difficult because, not a lot of patients have access to internet, but there has to be, again, a way of engaging patients. And there is usually the first phase would be a survey, a simple survey. There is typically a lot of overlap. There is a process of trying to collapse some of the same topics. And then the next step would be prioritizing, quantifying the importance. They can do a ranking, let's say, between 1 and 10. And this can be done in parallel between doctors, clinicians, and patients. But at the end, it has to be a merging of, typically facilitated in a face-to-face meeting, perhaps a day or an afternoon, to try to reach a conclusion with final list of priorities. This is published, the most common words used by patients. We had over 300 patients across different countries in Europe and over 150 glaucoma specialist ophthalmologists. And this is, you can see the yellow tries to highlight the priorities from patients. And there is a lot of overlap between important priorities from patients and clinicians and doctors. For example, better ways to stop sight loss or um, uh, improve treatments, improve diagnostic tests. These are common themes. But then there are also some interesting divergence. So, for example, for patients, finding a cure for glaucoma or restoring vision is most important. And we know that at the moment it's not feasible, but nevertheless, it's important to have that ambition and reflect that. There are other, in the other side, for example, we doctors, clinicians are very excited about the role of artificial intelligence. And it was mentioned before, for example, for screening, artificial intelligence is going to make our efforts more efficient. But the public and the patients haven't understood the value, and sometimes they feel almost threatened by artificial intelligence. So once you have the high level research question, then you need to focus your research question. When you're applying for funding, it has to be a very specific research question you want to answer. You cannot be at high level. You need to define the intervention or the diagnostic technology, potentially the value. What's the population, be specific about population and comparator and the outcome. And the outcomes, again, have to be relevant and have to be important. Just very briefly, how to make a good research question. Once you have the research priorities, you are confident that this is important for patients, for clinicians. Then, of course, has to be relatively novel and timely, and relevant to your population. So, for example, yes, there may be, it was mentioned before about a surgical innovation mix, and there is literature about it. But as someone also has mentioned, uh, trials for example, in Europe, Australia, or America are not necessarily relevant to your setting, and particularly you see the population, ethnic minorities are underrepresented in the Europe, America, Australia. So it's still important to do surgical research of surgical innovations with your populations. And it has to be feasible. And feasible, of course, there is a question about funding, but also has to be doable. You cannot, again, try to find a cure for glaucoma. That's, of course, not possible. So moving on, designing surgical trials and ideal collaboration. And trials, I'm a clinical scientist. And trials, the importance of randomized comparisons is we all know, when we're trying to compare, let's say, efficacy or effectiveness of two different surgeries or two different treatments, randomization is essential to prevent bias, and it has to be well done and properly done. And it's not easy to do trials, and it's expensive. But still, it's extremely important, and also in your setting, because again, the trials that we are producing in Europe and America, Australia, are not necessarily relevant because of differences in populations and genetic backgrounds. But the surgical trial is even more difficult, and again, the challenges can be overcome. But I think it's important to be aware of the additional difficulties when we design and trying to implement randomized trials, for example, or surgical trial evaluating surgeries. And this is important because in the past, and happening every day, there are surgical innovations that end up to be a complete disaster with major implications for health and in patients. For example, hip, replacement materials, hip devices, or breast implants, and vaginal mesh, terrible tragedies. And this is also in part because there was no proper um, steps to bring these devices to the market. Another reflection is that there is evidence that we are doing unnecessary surgeries, and this in the context of the NHS that is claiming to be evidence-based. So, for example, removal of chalasia, it doesn't need to be removed in the majority of cases. It's a self-limiting problem. It's only in a few patients that have significant persistent abnormalities, cosmetic or astigmatism with but it's a small minority, or arthroscopy for knee osteoarthritis. These are inefficient and useless devices, and still in the NHS we're down thousands a year. It's very difficult to change the behavior of surgeons. We are difficult uh, people to deal with and to change our behavior. In general, it's very difficult to change behavior, and that's something. So, a generation ago, in the late 90s, it was an editorial by the editor of the Lancet, Richard Horton, highlighting the deficiency and the poor state of surgical research. The majority of surgical research before this was based in case series of poor or poorly designed trials. And this led, well, and there are several reasons. I was telling you that it's very difficult to do surgical research. And this is that, for example, in medication research, medicines research, you use the drug and you can use placebo. And that's a very powerful way of avoiding bias in determining outcomes. But surgery is, again, more difficult. And the other challenge is that it's a complex intervention. If you think about how we do trabeculectomy, every single surgeon in the audience and online will do trabeculectomy slightly different, and that potentially can influence outcomes. But not only the surgical act, the environment, the surgical team, the post-operative care, how you can have access to care if there is a complication, all of these aspects can influence the outcome of a surgical intervention. And that's what this label is, a research term, complex intervention. There are aspects in surgical trials, particularly innovation, about the learning curve. How you quantify the impact of learning curve. How can you make sure that doesn't influence the results in a poor way? Quality assurance, again, in a way linked with learning curve. If you're trying to compare two different techniques, you want to make sure that the surgeons who are doing either technique are doing it properly, and that's easable for us because we can record our surgeries. Quantification of harms, this is not well done usually in surgical research or even in medical research. We need to be able to compare different profiles of complications. So as bringing to you the ideal collaboration that was brought about 15 years ago to try to tackle these deficiencies and facilitate the evaluation and the development of surgical innovations. And essentially, this, in a way, mirrors the stages of medical innovation. Essentially, the stage one is because when you have an idea, okay, there is a problem, you need a better surgeon, you need to sort out and move some unmet needs. From that you move to the development. Okay, this seems to be working. Let's try it, in a few more patients, maybe a collaborative effort with several surgeons or several units. The key of these early stages is transparency. You will want to tell the world, and that's easy with online resources, what you're trying to do. And even if what you have done, even if it doesn't work, and particularly important if it hasn't worked, because your idea is potentially has someone else in other parts of Africa or in Asia or anywhere else have probably a similar idea. And sharing the success, but also the failures is very important. So we don't, make the same mistake as a global community. Um, it's well known that there are important deficiencies in early phase evaluations, particularly about governance and transparency, lack of protocol. So transparency is the key thing. We did a systematic review of how surgical innovations regarding MIGS in glaucoma in the past decade or 2 decades have been introduced. And there are some good examples of good practice, but the majority of surgical innovations arrive to the market with this clear and open pathway about, early evaluations. It's not open to the public. It's potentially commercially sensitive. Another very brief aspect is that what we tell patients when we are trying a new surgery. So essentially, this is a paper, a fascinating study that the surgeon and the conversation between the surgeon and the patient about the surgical innovation was recorded with consent from both, of course. and there was serious deficiencies. The surgeons were not able to tell them, the limitations of evidence and limitations of experience. But about surgical trials, again, I was telling you the difficulties of conducting trials. We also did a systematic review, and again, we highlighted the suboptimal or the poor quality of reporting all these soft aspects, but important aspects about learning curve, quality assurance, prospective registration of trials. Now, learning curve, I mean, again, there are many things we can talk about an hour about or more about learning curve. There's a lot of literature, and again, this has been well reported and well done in some trials, but in the majority of surgical trials, this is not well reflected. Quality assurance, I was telling you, we can record surgeries, and now we can analyze surgeries even with artificial intelligence. Quality assurance is doable and is not being done properly. So just to bring you, there is a guide on surgical innovation for glaucoma from the European Glaucoma Society. This is open access to everybody. You go to the web page, and that has reflecting some of these concepts. And just very quickly to finalize, again, surgical trials are expensive and difficult, but you can still, if you don't have the resources to do trials, you can also have very powerful data and very important, to advance the field. And this importance of long-term evaluation using surgical registries. So in the UK, that we have a number of surgical registries, not in ophthalmology, in glaucoma. That may happen in the near future, not mandatory. But essentially in UK, the National Registry for Orthopedic for hip replacement identified early systematic failures from the metal on metal hip replacement. So very early, because of this registry, it was changed. It was a very strong signal that this type of devices had to be stopped. And that saves a lot of misery and difficulties to a lot of patients. So that's the practical implications. At the moment in the UK, we have 47 active surgical registry. 18 of them are mandatory. And I leave it with you again. I know you're recording this presentation. These are steps for a surgical registry. You have to involve, of course, patients, surgeons. There has to be support, financial and institutional support. Again, this is not easy, but it's worthwhile doing. And just to, there are a couple of surgical registries, one from Australia, one from the UK, and the adoption, apparently is increasing, and that's a huge step forward. Congratulations to this effort. But the problem is that this is not mandatory and is not prospective. So this potentially a risk of bias. But this is a trailblazing effort that we should all embrace. And this is my last comment. Electronic medical records, that's again a very powerful way of looking at surgical outcomes, long-term outcomes. There are many examples in the literature, and that's something that potentially is very doable if you have the ability of having electronic medical records. My last slide, there are funding opportunities in the UK for global health. Hopefully, people from Africa have access to funding. I am aware also in other countries, but this is the link to the UK. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Professor Blanco. Okay, so I have